Hello, hello. Relationships can be difficult if you don't share the same vision. Sometimes you just have to look at things through a different lens. Today's story is written by pietyblues. This happened in my junior year of college, and I've never forgotten a moment of it since. It's been nearly a decade since this all went down. Since I changed universities, moved 2 towns, and then eventually an entire state over, and spent the whole time trying to scrub these events from my mind. Of course, to no avail. Every second of it is as fresh as it was yesterday. In my junior year, I had been attending the University of Oklahoma as a biology major. I wanted to go for pre-med, but felt I wasn't ready to lose the ability to both be in school and still get blackout drunk most nights. I wasn't very smart in other aspects of my life, but that's neither here nor there. My girlfriend's name was Katie. We'd met in our sophomore year at some coffee shop a little way off campus. I wouldn't say we had a meet cute, considering I nearly took her eye out with the front end of my pen while she was walking by my little table. Of course, her eye had remained intact, and I had spent nearly a half an hour apologizing and even offered to buy her a latte or whatever she drank to make up for it. Really, I just wanted to keep talking to her. Katie was easygoing and unashamedly flirtatious, and she sat with me and sipped some non-fat coffee drink that was all milk and no coffee. From there it had been like clockwork, a whirlwind college romance story that featured coffee dates and a lot of missed classes. After almost a year together, Katie had moved in with me at my apartment and made it hers. I didn't mind, obviously. I just wanted to spend all my time with her. And in case you were wondering, the thought of being pre-med hadn't crossed my mind in months. In fact, I was slacking so hard in my studies that my scholarship was barely hanging on by a thread. Katie was like no girl I had ever met before. And believe me, I know how that sounds. Like I'm some love-struck idiot that falls hard and fast for the first girl to give me any kind of attention. I swear it wasn't like that. But in hindsight, I don't think I even knew what it was. I just knew Katie and I were meant to be together. I haven't told you what Katie looked like. And maybe it's because, after all these years, I'm still too selfish to share her with anyone. She had this olive skin that put my own milky complexion to shame. I wasn't like an ugly guy. And dark hair that stopped at the small of her back, always curling and smelling like peaches. She was intoxicating. But what I loved most about Katie were her eyes. They were brilliant blue and shone in the dark, almost piercing if she fixed you with the right or wrong look. It was hard to take her seriously sometimes during fights or arguments when she looked at me with a glare meant to kill. All I saw was my Katie, ocean-eyed and beautiful. It wasn't until almost 8 months into our relationship that Katie let me in on her big secret, that she wore color contacts. She said she'd been afraid to tell me because of how much I loved her eyes, and because of how often I told her. I had smiled and told her she was ridiculous. Of course, I loved her eyes, but they weren't that important in the grand scheme of things. I loved her because of who she was, and how kind and warm she was. She lit up when I told her that I didn't care what color her eyes were, and she kissed me, batted her colored eyes at me a few times, and then kissed me again. After that, I noticed she would switch her contacts out a lot. Some days they were a gorgeous gemstone green or a sterling gray. She still looked gorgeous, despite whatever color she wore that day, and I always made sure to tell her. Her smile was always worth it. Katie refused to change her contacts or even take them out when I was in the room with her. I didn't really see what the big deal was, considering I was an avid contact wearer myself. Thank you, stigmatism. And was no stranger to people sticking their fingers in their eyes to take them out. Regardless, I still left the room whenever she changed her contacts or took them out before bed. As I said, it wasn't a big deal to me, but Katie told me that she just felt uncomfortable when people watched her fiddle with her contacts. Something about always dropping them or whatever when someone else was looking. Whatever that meant. It wasn't until the start of senior year that I had seen Katie take her contacts out. We were still living in my apartment and our relationship was as good as the day we met. I was actually browsing for engagement rings on my lunch breaks at work. The little boy fantasy of marrying a gorgeous woman unfolding in my brain. I couldn't help it though. I loved Katie and I knew I wanted to spend the rest of my life with her. It helped that I knew she wouldn't say no. It had been a Thursday night and I had gotten home from work. We had had dinner together and watched some stupid movie on the TV, more enthralled with each other than the 3-star blockbuster they were showing. I had just gotten out of the shower and was making my way to our bedroom. The door was ajar and I saw Katie on her side of the bed, opening up her contact case. I leaned against the door frame, hidden from Katie, and couldn't help but smile to myself. There sat my gorgeously weird girlfriend, who I've seen naked and who I've seen cry tears and snot before more times than I could count, who was still too nervous to let me see her switch her contacts. I noticed her contact case was a lot bigger than any of the ones I had ever used myself, but shrugged it off. Whatever, contact cases were always different wherever you got them from. I stood and watched as Katie raised her hand to her left eye, presumably to pinch the contact and take it out. I felt the breath leave my lungs as I watched her pluck her entire left eye out of her head. She was completely still as she did so, humming to herself as she used her other hand to screw open one side of her large contact case and dropped the eye she was holding into it. With her right eye still intact, she reached around behind her and pulled out another contact case. I realized these were the eyes she was going to put on instead. I watched her complete this process with ease, switching out her eyes and cleaning up any mess she left behind. She neatly put both contact cases in her bedside drawer and shut it. She blinked slowly a few times, like she was letting her new eyes adjust to her skull. I felt bile rising in my throat. I'm not sure how long I stood there, motionless. My eyes had glazed over at one point, and I was so sure that I couldn't have seen what I thought I had. There was no way my girlfriend of 2 years, the woman I was planning on asking to marry me, had just plucked out both her eyes and put in a new set. When I felt like I could feel my feet again, I walked into our bedroom and sat down on my side of the bed, still wrapped in a towel from my shower. Katie was sitting up in the bed beneath the covers reading a book. She smiled at me when I laid down next to her, raising her hand and stroking my hair a little. She asked me if I was ready for bed, and I nodded. And before rolling off to our respective sides, she kissed me. She pulled away and looked at me with someone else's green eyes. The rest of that night went by in a flash. I didn't even bother sleeping. I waited until Katie was fast asleep and snoring softly before I quietly crept around to her side of the bed. I opened her bedside drawer and peeked in. There were dozens of those contact cases, scattered next to empty wrappers and a water bottle. If this were any other kind of situation, I would have made fun of her for how much of a slob she was. I grabbed a handful of cases and crept to the bathroom. I locked the door behind me and sat down on the closed toilet seat. I didn't know how badly my hands were shaking until I brought one of the cases closer to my face. I unscrewed the cap. An eyeball looked back at me. It was bobbing in some kind of clear liquid solution that stank of chemicals. I wondered briefly what kind of chemical was necessary to keep eyes fresh, keep them on ice. I left that night. I put Katie's cases back and packed a bag, clothes, chargers, my wallet, even my passport. I didn't know where I was going yet, but I knew I couldn't come back there. I didn't want to. I dropped out of the University of Oklahoma the next day. I remember getting in my car and just driving. My phone rang a dozen times, presumably Katie freaking out and wanting to ask me where I was. I never picked up. That was 10 years ago. I returned back to college when I was 28, settling in a small town in Kansas named Lebanon. I've never gotten married. I still have nightmares about what I found in Katie's drawer. Nightmares of her finding me and coming for my eyes. She always told me they were such a pretty color. Thank you for listening. You can probably handle another horror story, right?